Probably the most common question I get from beginning spoon carvers is what's the best hand tool to carve the bowl portion of a spoon? There are two basic tools, a gouge and a hook knife, that really lend themselves to carving spoon bowls. There's pros and cons of each, so today I want to talk about the specific type of gouge and hook knife that I like and how to get good use out of them. This is my favorite basic configuration of a gouge that works well for spoon bowls. The number one thing that matters to me is that it's approximately 1.25 inches wide, thereabouts, give or take maybe 1/8 of an inch. And it has a moderate amount of sweep, whatever that curvature is. I don't know the number of this particular one. And then also, very importantly, the bevel has to be on the outside, not the inside. So this would be called an out cannel gouge. And that bevel needs a slight curvature, but only slight. If that's too convex on the bevel, it won't work very well. Quick little tip, before I start carving with the gouge, I want to knock down these corners, especially out here, so they don't dig into my wrists and palms. There, just that little bit is fine. If you're like most people, your first instinct is going to be to try to come at the workpiece like this, kind of like you're using a shovel, using your shoulders. You're going to have no control that way. So this gets back to why we chamfered that corner there. What you want to think about is anchoring a pivot point to the workpiece and using that to steer. So your non-dominant hand is going to steer. Your dominant hand is going to apply force and leverage, just like so. And you'll have so much more control when you stabilize yourself against the workpiece and think of levering and prying those chips out. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and start taking some chips out here. I'm going to make a shallow trench down the middle, just push cutting. This is 3 passes, so of 6 or 7 cuts. So that's about 20 cuts at this point, and a decent amount of material is taken out. Notice it's all choppy over here because I'm exiting like that, and that's fine for roughing out, but for the finish cuts, you're going to have to start at the rim and cut down toward the bottom center on every cut, basically. But I'm still a fair bit away from the rim, and I'm not yet worried about blowing out and getting a rough tear at that rim. So I'm just going to cut the way that removes the material fastest until I have to worry about those finish cuts. I'm not maybe going to do these big passes all the way across. I'm going to start nibbling in down toward the bottom middle and approaching that rim from the outside inward, if that makes sense. Now, I'm right-handed, but to get the best approach working all the way around this, it's very helpful to learn how to do some of this ambidextrously. So you'll see me switching back and forth right and left-handed cutting. See, what I'm doing is moving back a couple of millimeters from that top surface with each bite. If you try to take too big of a bite, it'll take too much force, and then you'll blow through and probably go over and gouge on the other side. So I don't know if it comes through on camera, but I can definitely tell that cutting right-handed, trying to cut up this way, and these are still roughing cuts, I'm getting a much choppier, splintery kind of surface cutting this direction than when I cut left-handed. Much smoother. So it may be better to just work left-handed across this entire bowl, and that is just going to be the case sometimes. So I left this spoon bowl at about the level I think you can get to with a little practice with a halfway decently tuned gouge. And this is even a non-ideal wood for spoons. It's maple, but this is hard maple, so it is much more dense and harder to push the tool through. But I think, you know, within a handful of practice attempts, you ought to be able to get to something like this. Now let's talk about hook knives. This probably is what you've seen. I'm just going to set that aside. I don't recommend this kind, the short-handled ones where you cut towards your thumb. Virtually everybody I know who has tried these as a beginner has ended up with stitches. So we're going to set this aside. And if you are dead set on a hook knife, I recommend a two-handed version for multiple reasons, which we'll get into. Technique is important with a gouge, but it's even more important with a hook knife like this. So instead of forcing my way through the cut most of the time, especially when I initially I'm going to make some big rapid cuts to take a bunch of bulk out, and there's a flick technique I'm going to use that takes some practice to learn, but it's very effective once you get a grasp of it. Okay, so for the hook knife, I've got a double overhand grip. It's a right-handed hook knife. My dominant hand, my right hand, is way toward the back, and my left hand is up near the front, but not all the way over, you know, not over the blade. And these initial power cuts, they have to be fast. That's very important. If you're too slow, it'll just bind in there, and it can be dangerous when you actually do pull out of there with kind of unchecked inertia. The only way to really describe it is to show it. So I'm going to choose my location to start and dig in and just really flick that thing through. So I'm curling my wrists and pulling up toward myself slightly like that. I've done as much as I want to of those power strokes in this direction toward this rim. Now I need to do that direction. So with my shave horse setup here, I'm going to swing this over, let it hang outboard like so, and now I have access with that same kind of power cut to work toward this rim. But I'm going to stay inside that pencil line for sure at this point. Back to the other side. And I'm going to use the controlled cut, but I'm going to try to cut very shallow. I work on a shave horse, but I know not everybody has those. All you really need is some way to immobilize your workpiece at kind of hip to waist height. So these jaw horse style vices are great, versatile. You can stow, they fold up and you can stow them away when you're not using them. Or even just a heavy duty clamp. You can clamp the workpiece to a deck railing or a picnic table, something like that. But I just wanted to show the approach you would take with these tools in this different configuration. If you don't have a lot of upper body mass or strength, you may prefer working this way because you can use your body weight to help push through the cuts. You can kind of work from the hips instead of the shoulders and arms. And here's the hook knife. Here's the finish from the hook knife. For me, with the experience I have, it's easier for me to get kind of a more uniform, less choppy of a finish with the hook. Let's look at that side by side again, yeah, with the gouge. They both make perfectly serviceable spoons. Some people actually like the more extensive tool marks from the gouge. But let's talk about some of the other aspects of these tools that I think should have more of an influence on which one you would want to use rather than the finish they leave. Now, hook knives are great. I love them. I make them. I sell them. I want to sell these, so keep in mind, the advice I'm going to give you is to set that aside for now. If you're a beginner, get a gouge. 4 reasons why, 4 main reasons. Number 1, gouges are much easier to find. There's antique ones like this, but most woodworking stores, Rockler, Woodcraft, have new gouges that are great. They just require a little honing. They're great. They're widely available, and they're just not hard to get a hold of like a good hook knife is. Number 2, cost. A good gouge, under $100. You might get lucky and find a decent one for under $20 at an estate sale or something. A good hook knife, you're in the hundreds, okay? And for many makers of good hook knives, there's a waiting list too to get a hold of those. So cost, definite advantage again to the gouge. Number 3 is sharpening and maintenance. So hopefully, whichever tool you end up with, it doesn't require a ton of grinding. Hopefully it has a decent geometry to start with. But even if you do need to totally reprofile the geometry, that's much easier to do with a gouge. Also, the routine maintenance sharpening is a lot easier with a gouge as well. And number 4 is cutting yourself. Cheap, expensive, doesn't matter. Hook knives just are the number 1 tool I cut myself with, and they certainly are ones I see beginners get themselves with all the time. Gouges are much safer to use. That kind of rounds out a solid block of advantages for the gouge for beginners.